Mr. President.
Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, tomorrow the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions will begin consideration of a 615-page bill. It seeks to reform our nation's health care system. This bill, introduced by Senator Kennedy and others just last week, has very grand ambitions. We all agree that health care reform is necessary. We all agree that Congress must act, but we must not act recklessly. We must not act with haste and political expediency. Health care reform will affect each and every American, and we must do it right. I strongly believe that we have to start over and act in a truly bipartisan manner to address the issue. Unfortunately, the legislation before that committee seeks to enact a massive government-run health care program that intrudes into the lives of all Americans by making decisions on each American's choice of doctors, employer health plans, and insurance providers, and it leaves major questions unanswered. Every American should know the answer. How much will this massive expansion of government cost? And every taxpayer should have a clear answer to how our taxpayers are going to pay for this massive government expansion. Yesterday, the Congressional Budget Office released a letter that stated that the Kennedy bill, the bill now pending for markup tomorrow, beginning tomorrow, in committee, would ensure only one-third of the 47 million Americans that are currently uninsured for the cost of $1 trillion. $1 trillion over 10 years. And again, that only insures one-third of the uninsured. Let me quote, Mr. President, from the Congressional Budget Office report. It says, once the proposal, that's the bill that we are now considering in the Health Committee, once the proposal was fully implemented, about 39 million individuals would obtain coverage through the new insurance exchanges. At the same time, the number of people who had coverage through an employer would decline by about 15 million, or roughly 10%, and coverage from other sources would fall by about 8 million, so the net decrease in the number of people uninsured would be about 16 million. There's 47 million who are unemployed, who are without health insurance in America. So this matches, Mr. President, with an executive summary entitled The Impact of the 2009 Affordable Health Choices Act, which is completed by the HSI Network, done by Steve Perini, Ph.D., and Lisa Tomei, MS. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that this report be included in the record. And what this study concludes is it authenticates the Congressional Budget Office, because what it says, if you want to insure every American, it's going to be $4 trillion. Not one, but $4 trillion over a 10-year period. So, to ensure coverage for all Americans under the, as proposed legislation, it would cost $460 billion annually, or $4 trillion over the next 10 years, according to a report issued last week, as I mentioned. So the best we can tell, the cost of the legislation that we are now considering is $4 trillion. Now, how are we going to pay for that, Mr. President? How are we going to pay for it? Is there a proposal yet besides eliminating fraud, abuse, and waste? Well, it's unacceptable, and it isn't health care reform, and I believe that the CBO letter should be a wake-up call to all of us in this chamber to scrap the current bill and start all over in a bipartisan fashion with true negotiations. Yesterday, the President of the United States said the opponents of his legislation or his proposals were fear-mongering. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that assessment, nor do I accuse the proponents of this bill of that motivation. This isn't health care reform. Any bill that strips 23 million Americans of their current health care coverage and ensures a mere third of the 47 million uninsured Americans is not what Americans are looking for in legislation. And let me say, Americans aren't calling. They aren't calling for a massive government expansion. They're calling for a new government insurance plan that'll do away with existing private insurance plans or enact a broad government panel exerting command and control of individual, small group, and large employer health care plans. They aren't calling for new taxes, cuts to health care services, or penalties if individuals or small businesses' health coverage doesn't comply with Washington standards. They're not calling for a $1 to $4 trillion to be spent to fund the appetite of some who are hungry for more government intrusion into the daily lives of Americans. Americans need health surety, good and complete health care coverage, the security of knowing they have a job, and even better, a job where an employer can afford to provide health care coverage. If the employer doesn't provide coverage, we need to make it easier and affordable to get health care coverage for an American. Two ideas. One, give every American family $5,000 refundable tax credit and let them go out and get an insurance policy that meets their needs. And let them go across state lines if they feel like doing it. That's pretty simple. It's not real complicated. It can be done in a bipartisan way and in a matter of weeks. That's not what's happened here, despite all of their calls along with the president for bipartisanship. But it can be done if we really want to solve the problem for the American people. I believe it's time for Democrats and Republicans to come together and draft a bill that gets Americans the health care coverage needed at affordable rates, and this should be our goal, ensuring that all Americans have coverage, not just 16 million, as the Congressional Budget Office study indicates. Everybody covered, not unsustainable government expansion. And again, I'm calling on the White House and the Democrats to scrap this unsustainable bill and sit down and let's start from scratch. According to news reports this morning, Robert Gibbs stated this morning, quote, "This is not the administration's bill," after the CBO letter came out. Well, where is the administration's bill? We're supposed to be enacting legislation before the end of July. And where is the administration's bill? We can't afford this one. We can't afford the one that is supposedly going to be enacted into legislation that will come to the floor of this Senate. It does an injustice to our taxpayers and their children. 42% of U.S. voters are saying that cutting the deficit is the most important priority for the country. The bill that is being considered tomorrow in the Health Committee is an extraordinary step in the wrong direction. So, Madam President, let me just say, scrap this bad bill. Pay attention to the Congressional Budget Office. Understand it doesn't achieve the goal of coverage. Understand that the cost would be around $4 trillion over a 10-year period, for which so far there is almost no provision to pay for. And let's sit down together and work together in order to provide Americans with the health care they need at a reasonable cost.